When I was, say, 25, I would say I was literally riddled with distrust, and I had to do that too, didn't I? With distrust and anxiety. This was the air I breathed, and not knowing, and to know anything seemed like a dubious, absurd, reckless, and unkind kind of undertaking. I lived on the virtual. That which was pleasant and fortunate in my circumstances was, to me, too good to be believed, despite my delight in it. And that which was worrisome or distressing to me in my own circumstances appeared to be generated primarily of my own inner conflicts and disorganization. This air of not quite being there that I breathed, nevertheless, afforded me, once accepted, ample sustenance to allow me to play, at least in the alienated province of art production. Setting my play aside that way seemed to afford me a potentially refreshing freedom of activity and scope of potentiality, and to allow me poetry. This play, then, was crucial to me. These conditions were the wellspring of my opportunity for what I came to take for realism of expression and understanding in my life, such that I could find traction in an effort to articulate how it was occurring in its multivalent interdependency and disintegration. Under such conditions, the assumption of facts, binding recognitions, and synthetically resolved conclusions, which I had been taught to bear as knowledge, I felt viscerally as fatal threat, numbing, canceling, desubstantiating. Might not, instead, taking anything apart, yield a knowing in the throes of uncertainty and curiosity, unmanageable by any assumptions of well-earned synthesis. Analysis was play, so far as I could tell. There was always both an irresponsible and a responsible aspect to it. It could be relied on not to go anywhere, or at least not to stay there. It had no end and no beginning. It was a matrix of discourse, a realm like art production, discrete from that purported terra firma of an established actuality, wherein lay crouching responsibility. If you're not muted, I recommend you mute yourself, because otherwise certain things tend to happen on Zoom. My experience of that place in that time was also pretty romantic, in that it held out promises of transmutation. The forms that seeming process took would depend on what happened to us and what we did with it. This took place between people. The actual experiment was interpersonal. To be artistically active among interested peers, some of whom would collaborate, agreeing to engage in preposterous and highly idiosyncratic processes of composition together, to be able to play so vigorously, deliberately, and concertedly, while we intuited and reasoned and argued and distorted among ourselves the terms and values for the choices and excitement we participated in. This experience realized a dream gestated in childhood, born in adolescence, and now found active in an everyday life, no longer academic. what though these friends of mine were doing made a simple, appealing sense to me in a way that none of my other options and ideas of a career or life path did. It was magical to me to be able to join them and others in the open-ended improvisational structuring of an artistic interference pattern, wriggling with the tension of mutual challenge and encouragement. This may have been made more possible because San Francisco had then, for me, for those questioning their place in this country, a magical romantic aura about it. And in that, a tension between fantasy and reality that I couldn't untangle. I didn't find I needed to. We played in our work as writers as seriously and conscientiously as any 3-year-old. Once a week, I saw a young psychotherapist at a public clinic, free because my income was so slight. After a while, she complained of being bored with me. I expected her to cut me if I asked her for advice. I seemed to have felt preoccupied by others' dependence on me. I was aware this might be my delusion. I was aware of seeking to be supported utterly by another. And who is this me? This I, perpetually reacting to himself and others, the reflection of his need. Who or what? What was I seeking in its place? Responsibility? The ability to respond, to integrate reaction and reflection in resolve, in action. I figured maybe it was that. Meanwhile, I hovered in gay bars, seeking to recognize the ideal in men I could rarely approach. It was dark there, with garish color highlights and imaginary flickering halos. I was looking for the artist who would check me out. Is there anyone here who would like to be me? As if my goal were to discover someone to embody that role about whom I could fantasize afterward. I was also looking for truth through desire. In effect, if we were not locked in a perfect, easeful bliss eternally, I would just rack myself in my frustrations, perplexing iron bed. I felt certain I deserved something more real, palpable, release, and that I must be holding out on myself. How? By my shyness, my mentality, running in circles. I kept glimpsing myself from behind just before disappearing around the corner. Typing had been a species of realization to me, whether of absurdist fantastical daydreams channeled into stories at pubescence, letters to beloved friends that assured me when in doubt that my relationships were genuine, or poems that turned careless momentary wrinkles in my imagination into tentative gestalts. The poem appeared at times to portend me, yet it always pointed somewhere else. Its insistence on difference as necessary as that of a Warhol detergent carton or the Beatles cover of an R&B song. So, what was your political role in the family? Oh, well, at home growing up, I was sort of the ironist, the underminer, the question asker. I used to take pride in a bitter way in rendering authority inadequate, but I was also the peacemaker, the quiet center once removed, the listener. And then also I became the aesthete of the family, reframing my bedroom as an art gallery or as a writing studio. With my renegade cousin, I made an artists and writers club that commanded a corner of the basement. She and I engaged in occult practices. Others couldn't appreciate it. Drawing, writing, drinking tea, talking in English accents. They were mysteriously subversive to the others, partly because they were private, but with the threat of going public. So this was your first experience of participating in an art movement? Well, yeah, I guess it was. And I got to ally with friends in happenings and underground film, some in high school, and a lot with independent poetry and drama while I was in college. And then I joined an MFA program in poetry writing without any comrades to counter the atomizing, normalizing influences. So there, I was just alone with my difference, showing it, and it was acknowledged, like in your family. Yes, they were sort of impressed, but now it was largely frailness, failing, flailing, and self-sabotage that was on display, as everything centered on the portrayal of the self, the betrayal of the self. Yes, that's what I meant. Then, in language writing, self became a tool, a weapon, a cipher, an open question, all sorts of things, and next to nothing, but always something else. It didn't vanish. It just wasn't willing to be taken for granted anymore, which was tremendously right and exciting. We were not alone, and we were not a crowd. We didn't have committees. No one was in charge. Leadership was always driven by projects and personalities, and so it was open to question at all points. There was no group position on the admissibility of specific political or literary trends and identities, but we could all recognize these and consider them. Steve could be seen as a gay poet or not. I am alarmed by the richly knotty, multi-tactical, intraclausal interventions and prolix parenthetical candor and humility of my writing in these letters. I took and accepted a lot of license then in writing to an individual other, and I was eager to stress and stretch and chew apart the values and the frames inhering in such opportunities. Correspondingly, reading these letters in 2007, now I am struck by the radically different texture and situation of correspondence 30 years ago, when electric typewriter was the most advanced technology available to us. Letters were then often 3 or 4 pages long and may have taken hours to write, yet often responses were anticipated within the week. Charles's letters are typed and single-spaced with slender margins, peppered with corrections, deletions, and additions in ball-point pen. Bernard's handwritten letters on lined paper apologize for his script, proffer marginal notes and collaged enclosures, and flow on recklessly in digressively suspended time and wanton foolishness. Everyone wrote on the back of all sorts of other print. Letters organized and crystallized a time for us to think, in which we used the occasion of another's promptings and attention to process and evaluate our own concerns, literary, social, cultural, existential, or political. Letters carried such complex weavings of subjectivity, such elaborately individuated reinforcement and interference patterns, that they afforded rich opportunities to get to know someone and to inflect the quality of a relationship in subtle, powerful ways. Oh, the books come with a nice dust jacket, which can slip off and on, sometimes by accident. I think any actual sexual liberation for me entailed a largely private, idiosyncratic fantasy to loosen, spread, roll over, fly, a fantasy in which being and coming were indistinguishable, apparent only as becoming. The wish for sensual, proprioceptive bodily release from ground-bound rules of responsibility, for a free encounter with the air and any matter, finds form to some degree in the open fall, also known as negative capability, of reorientations within barely constrained performances of oral improvisation. In elaborated experiences like writing 50 blue books filled out without looking back, persistently foregrounding present effort to write as assertively and well as possible without revising, and in extended serial works like Briarcombe paragraphs and reverse order, for which I dissected, altered, revisioned, and fantastically transmuted each paragraph or stanza into its replacement with an obliged sort of fidelity to it, presented subsequently in a series. Through writing, I wanted to realize this wanton will to release innate, untested, and perhaps unfounded capabilities through meeting the other, language, and therefore human culture and shared knowledge, engaging the medium as something elastic, tensile, porous, mutable, everywhere resistant and yielding, imminent, and ready to be overthrown. The body isn't known in words, which only portray simulacra, stand-ins, straw men. In a poetry performance, such as when reading aloud, the body can be marvelously present or offensively negated, insensitively neglected, bluntly ignored. The body may represent or presence the work in a stance or the instant transitory holding of the body, effectual as the occasion of the words. This happens when the body in its occasion is not taken for granted. My understanding about language poetry has been accumulating over the years, that what we have had in common, not just the 10 of us, but all of those who are or were actively involved with it, was the underlying assumption that nothing was to be taken for granted about poetry and about language. I don't know that I've ever heard such a notion associated with language poetry, and perhaps I am alone in this impression of it. There's no mention in my journals of many long rehearsals for Carla's first play, Third Man, in the journal of those weeks, nor for its performance or reception. I just didn't write about it in my journal. I don't know why. Perplexed and excited by my part as Loop, which consisted entirely of complexly elaborated, lengthy speeches delivered in soliloquy without any apparent relation to the plot, action, or other characters of the play, I concentrated on memorization, supported by readings of Francis Yates' Arts of Memory and A.R. Luria's Mind of the Mnemonist. I tried gradually to associate gestures with the words so I wouldn't forget them, but mostly I tried to associate the clauses that conveyed all the phrases with diverse turns of mind, including attitudes toward the representation of individual position and stance, such as I'd learned them from watching others and criticizing myself. That is, Loop hadn't any identity or personal consciousness to speak of, so far as I could tell, as I remember, a big qualification. But like an everyman as chorus, he spoke for us all, without speaking as any of us would, and so represented as a character ways of acting out the deliberate delivery of verbally contextualized intellection of experience to others. What Loop's verbiage might seem to say as wisdom, propaganda, worldview, or reframe remains by and large beside the point, or at least outside my scope for my purposes as a performer of his speeches. More important was how I'd hold my head and arms, the tone of voice, the rhythm of the cadences, whether my brow was furrowed or my fingers loose. Does this make it more poet's theater than not? I asked, what's wrong with this picture? Because there's always something wrong with a picture. And yet we typically seek for the picture to be right. For me, to engage in poetry productively rather than imitatively was to discover and explore what was not right with the picture, with the language, with my attempts at representation. There was little reason to attack anyone else for theirs. The faults were always there for all to see at their discretion. My thesaurus defines ambitious as a kind of what? Of a kind, as of a kind to try or exceed one's power of performance. This is how Zen meditation has always seemed to me. And yet it has also always seemed inclusive of anyone's effort and personal manner and need. The thesaurus lists as contrasted with ambitious the words easy, plain, straightforward, feasible, practicable, realistic, unpretentious. And these apply to sitting zazen as well. Both sides of ambitious appear central to my intentions in performance as a writer, both the synonym and the antonym. Sitting zazen then seems to have rhymed with or preconditioned my literary efforts, as if I'm holding a paradox in balance or spilling contradictions all around me. Realizing how perplexing, complex, daunting, edgy, and enviable, and eventually valuable, I found sitting in a quiet room, looking at nothing while counting my breath, has informed my expectations for public performances as well. to attempt something simple without grounds or goals with which to anticipate success. Something I thought anyone could do or try as well as I has been my practice as a writer and performer. In writing, I can practice a discipline without insisting on its goal or function, without being derailed by unwanted lapses from adherence. Observing and putting words to what occurs to my mind under certain circumstances. Noticing as well as I can what may stir me to a difference in attention has offered me more generative opportunities for writing than has reaching for or refusing ideas and impressions. Effects build on effects, while effects also decay. Attending in unpremeditated and potentially surprising formulations in response to what is bound to change has served me indispensably in making works that appear to me to stand up. To write and publish the grand piano's 10 volumes, the 10 of us have to get along and find consensus over a period now of more than 10 years. This is not always easy, but the hardest may be staying with it. Each of us has our own sensitivities. Each of us has our own incentives to quit, to go on, to change the subject. Deadlines imposed on a group basis shift abruptly in response to individual needs, crises, and occupations. The pressure to participate on time in a situation hurtling forward on scarcely predictable telescoping of rhythms in various dimensions creates acute stress and challenges concentration. How do I focus on this in 10 separate initiatives? And how do I address my partners in how they have responded so differently to this shared challenge? Am I rude? Do I fail to understand? Am I trying halfway hard enough? Whose skin is thinner at the moment? Are we respecting the interests of all those who are named and those who are not? I'm pointing out that all the work generated some discomfort in us, as well as in those who objected and supposed themselves as other and thereby excluded. I think we welcomed this as bracing, this sense that something we didn't understand was being enacted. And besides, it let us know we were alive. It was not just noodling about. There was something going on, but we didn't all know just what it was any more than Mr. Jones in Bob Dylan's negative anthem. Language poetry worked its discomfort into the seams of the poetry scene in which it found itself. It appeared to precipitate around itself tendencies toward demonization and conflict, stigma and judgment as means to cope with the defensiveness and disorganization it engendered. I think we language poets often felt refreshed and rewarded by our own experiences of doubt, perturbation, overwhelm, and lack of bearings in appreciating works of evident rigor and integrity. I recall we were often hurt, upset, angered, frustrated, and surprised at the negative reactions to such work by others who saw it as a problem unacceptable to them. We often had a problem ourselves with others averring limits or boundaries to us as a group. I wrote the essay in volume 1 when I was 50, and the essay in volume 10 when I was 60. I could tell by the text itself. I think we were choosing to write such that while testing what might transgress accepted means, we could sustain, so that readers could sustain, attention to how language made meaning, reference, linkage, closure, possibility, not just once in a while, but persistently. There has been a gift received in either direction, that of not knowing really just how what has been understood has corresponded to the understanding of another. In 1980, I first read Acker's Childlike Life of the Black Tarantula, Barth's Pleasure of the Text, Benjamin's Origins of German Tragic Drama, Berrigan's Train Ride, Bresson's Notes on Cinematography, Dante's Inferno, Gluck's Family Poems, Grenier's Oakland, Kerouac's Big Sur, Lautréamont's Maldoror, Lepard's Eva Hesse, Luria's Man with the Shattered World, Mayer's Studying Hunger, Notley's Alice Ordered Me to Be Made, Rayworth's Serial Biography, Rich's On Lies, Secrets, and Silence, Scalapino's Considering How Exaggerated Music Is, Woolf's The Waves, and the autobiography of Charles Darwin. I read Ida, The Island, and The Ego and the Id. And I read things by my friends. Granted, for me, language's existence on the page was a qualified one. The language wasn't actually there. It was the code for generating word events someone else had experienced some time before, speaking or thinking or writing them. The language itself was always elsewhere. The physical text, a stand-in under duress, existed on the page because an act had occurred. The duress here is the ostensible permanency of print, holding the act of verbal production to account. This duress is lately both temporally extended and diffused into the ether by electronic media's increasing hegemony over the dissemination of all such graphic symbols. The spatial arrangement of the written marks is a stand-in for the words themselves, and then also for the choice that they exist in that sequence, exclusive of others. Once my choices were in print, my sense was that they were stuck, and I was stuck with them, being associated with my name. I delighted in the peculiar premise and perception that print on the page might appear to be an end result, but I could not take it for granted. Reading works in public, I often skipped around in them, interlaced strands of them, altered, added, or repeated passages. They were material for reading. As products, they were stages in a process of which only parts and aspects could be apprehended at any one time. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it, truly.
I suggest you go to gallery view and you can unmute yourself. And according to our pre-planned format, we wanted to open the discussion up a bit, but 3 questions, let's say. So I'm looking for anybody who wants to contribute. And let's see what how Steve will respond.
Well, I'm just going to say that I thought it was a wonderful and I'm sorry that we won't see you this summer. And but soon. And I don't know how. Of course, one thing that naturally occurs to a person, to another author of the series, is to try and place what you presented in the context of one's own sense of what one has done, and in the same series. And I can say in candor that I failed completely at that in the most productive possible way, because it just allowed me to lean back and take in what you were doing. I'm sure that's not a very useful remark I just made, but it did break the ice. So if someone else—
Not a question, though. We're waiting for a question.
Oh,
Oh,
well, we have one from Joe Safdie, and either he could read it out or I will. Joe?
Go ahead, Barrett.
Okay. Steve, one gets the impression that you never revise your work. Do you?
Some of it I really revise, and some of it I try to keep as absolutely unrevised as I can bear and still release it. So they might have very, very, very minimal changes from how it was written in the first place or spoken in the first place. But other things, including these essays that are in the Grand Piano series, are very revised. I took time and care and changed things around and threw things out and added things in, of course, until it was published. And then it hasn't been revised since it was published. And it hasn't even been read out loud that I know of since it was published. Maybe there was actually a group reading or two that we did do. That was fun, a long time ago, about 10 years ago. That was good to have a bunch of us trying to read from it. But thanks for your question, Joe. And in general, it's a good impression to have, but often accurate of what I do.
Thanks.
You bet.
Joey Seamus just exhaled somewhere near St. Petersburg, Russia, and we can see him.
Yes. Hello.
Hi, Joe.
Thank you, Steve.
That's a remarkable communication. Someone else.
May I ask a question that I've often wanted to ask you, Steve? As a performance artist, which you are often, although not always, there's a huge amount of improvisation and dialoguing between you and whatever you're listening to. And often you're listening to something through headphones or responding to external information, text, sound, music, whatever. And I've wondered about how you would explain the ways in which a writer, as a writer, can also be an improviser during his, her, their writing time. That is not performance time, but how does one improvise in your experience as you yourself writing? How does one improvise? And this is related to Joe's question, obviously, about revision and lack thereof. But the process, like where does one start? Where does one go? How improvisational is that process, and how much do you correct the trajectories that get cast? Okay, end of question.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I can think of a little bit to say in response. One thing is that sometimes I've just written without knowing where it's going to go or what it's supposed to, not that it's supposed to be about anything. I don't really want it to get too hemmed in by being about anything, because I often find that it gets boring and I'm not able to live up to the pretensions of outlining ideas that fit together. But sometimes I have been able to. But in any case, there's a way in which writing 50 blue books in handwritten all, again and again and again over a period of about 12 months. But every time I sat down, I'd see if I could fill one, or at least write for half an hour or an hour straight, and try not to look back, not to question what I was writing, not to think about where it was going, but just to notice what the next word or phrase that might come up that I could find to say might be. And if it seemed to get too tangentious or predictable or rhythmically or in sound tones and syllables or anything, I would just try to, well, then I have to change that. Sometimes I could make up just a negation. I could think of what I was about to say and put a negative on it, so that, because I wasn't trying to tell the truth, I was just trying to keep the writing from becoming too tired and predictable, which I was not always successful at doing, but it was really fun to try. And part of the goal there was to have no particular consistent goal, except to keep writing and to keep wondering, what is the best way to do this? What is the best way to write right now? And to foreground that willingness and charge to myself, not as a discipline, because it wasn't by comparison with anybody else. It was just, what can I do as well as possible? But while still seeing that the text would not adhere to any rules in particular. Otherwise,
Thanks.
on the lines, pretty much.
Okay, now there's competition. There's one question in the chat, and Alan, so I can't possibly bear that would exclude one or the other. So let's go to the chat question first, and then to Alan, and we'll say that 3 equals 4, and that'll be a contribution to science. So James, do you want to read yours, or shall I read it? James is muted. So thanks for the reading. I really enjoyed the performance. Was there an outline flow chart for the camera and body movements, or were they completely improvised?
There was no flow chart or outline for them at all. I had thought earlier, like, oh, when I'm reading one of those books, 3 or 4, there's interview kind of back and forth between the speaker and the other speaker, and I would like be profile like this and profile like that, but I forgot all about it by the time it was to do that. And so everything was physically moving, the camera and my body and the furniture was just spur of the moment. I just knew I wanted to see whether that was a horrible or a good thing to do, at least on this occasion, and play with it and have that to be a little more fun.
Sandy.
Very cool.
Honey, I'm in the middle of my program that I told you not to interrupt.
Okay, I'm muting Steve Benson as soon as I can find him here.
It's in here somewhere.
Anyway, Alan, word to you.
Yeah. So, Steve, I'm my life partner is a social worker in private practice. And I've always been interested in reading your work about the relationship between your work in language and your practice as a social worker / psychologist. And you kind of worked with that a little bit in the earlier part of the reading, but I would be interested in hearing whatever you have to say about that.
Yeah, well, it's been sometimes easy and sometimes difficult to relate those two functions of being, but each of them has its own odd way of isolating me from the rest of my private and social life. If I'm doing psychotherapy in a room with one other person or perhaps a couple, it's not in some ways the same me that walks out the door at 6 o'clock and gets in the car and maybe goes to visit a friend or something. It's and same with writing. If I'm writing, whether it's oral improvisation and performance with people looking or listening, or whether it's at home or on the keyboard or by hand, it's a time apart. And I do seem to welcome that. With doing psychotherapy, it's like my main function above all is listening and accepting that what's happening is real and might be fully, even more fully real any minute, especially by my being aware of it. And writing is, it's interesting to reflect on it like that too. It's just writing right now when I'm writing. And I don't, I've gotten pretty good at not thinking too hard about what anybody else might think about what I'm writing while I'm doing it. There's some kind of inner critic, and there's some quiet little voices that are debating what to do while I write on the page in a notebook or something. But they don't interfere very much. They kind of mostly egg me on. And so I think as a therapist and as a writer, I'm kind of aware of surface level, and I'm aware of different depths and implications and relational factors, person to person relations, as well as person to medium relations, person to language relations. But there is an interpersonal quality in both that matters to me a lot. And that I can't cure or fix or solve other people's problems, but the interaction may make some kind of a difference. And I find in my own, sometimes when I have a life problem of some kind, just talking to somebody who doesn't have to say anything in particular helps me a lot to sort myself out and feel, a kind of inner resolution and purpose again. Those are some.
Thanks.
So thank you, audience, for your 4 questions and comments.
Beautiful.
I'm going to stop the recording. Before that, I just want to announce that the next episode in Grand Piano TV will be in 2 weeks, Lynn Higinian on August 11th. And I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can sort of wave goodbye to everybody and so forth.